Hi everyone, Joe here, and like you, I'm stuck inside a lot. It's getting nicer out. I do plan on spending some time outside. Fortunately, I have a big yard and I'm surrounded by woods. So I'm going to go out and do some shooting and actually do some portraits as well outdoors. However, today, what I'm here to share with you is an edit using Photoshop. I've been doing a lot of Lightroom stuff. It's time to make the move into Photoshop. Now this edit is all about contrast and color and light, and also some compositional things to narrow down the focus of the image. I'm going to cover a lot about layers and masks and things like that. We're also going to do a soft proof for preparing this image to go out to print when you send it out to a lab. Next week I'll be starting on an in-depth color series on color workflow, how to basically always get prints that look like your screen, whether you're printing it yourself or not. So it'll involve image capture with custom camera profiles, profiling your monitor, and then creating custom profiles for your printer papers. So that will take us from soup to nuts on how to get great prints that look like your screen every time. For today, however, we're going to narrow it down. We're going to do a single image edit. Although I did it fairly in depth. These videos of the edit is going to run over 20 minutes. There's conversation about what the image needs and different approaches to look for when you're crafting your composition. So let's take a look, and I'll see you again at the end. So I've been doing a lot of Lightroom demos lately, and I think it's time to get back and jump into Photoshop. And I've been doing a lot of color things. I'm working on a new color series. So I decided, well, you know what? Let's do something exclusively in Photoshop. So here's our image opened up in Adobe Camera Raw. I actually much prefer working in Lightroom for this kind of things. Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom are very similar softwares, just things organized in different places. And I guess when you get used to one, the other one can seem a little bit odd. I have to honestly say that I'm not a fan of Adobe Camera Raw because of the useful things that Lightroom has in it. And by the way, if you're using the current version of Photoshop, you've got Lightroom, so I highly recommend it. But if you're just a Photoshop person, then we're just going to do this entirely in Adobe Camera Raw. So we take a look at the image. This is a spot informally known as the Forrest Gump point. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, this is the road leading down into Monument Valley. This is on the Utah side. So let's just do some basic adjustments, because what we're after is really getting the color the best we can. So we look at the histogram and exposure looks pretty good. These shadows alongside of the road are a little deep, so let's open those up. All right, so we've got the shadows opened up. Before we do anything else, let's bring the texture up. And again, I'll add about half as much of clarity to that. Now, it does seem a little hazy off in the distance, so we're going to go ahead and add a little dehaze. Yeah, that does a good job in the sky. Probably still not enough on the formations. Vibrance, again, is cool and desaturated colors, so we'll add that to the sky. And then we'll add some overall saturation, which will bring up the rocks and things. Now, there's a lot more I want to do. I want to make these the formations of Monument Valley pop a little bit more. And I want to fix some of the color. But while we're here, now, as we've adjusted the image, we can see, well, actually, we've got some spots showing up now. So we're going to use the spot removal tool. Again, we could do this later in Photoshop, but we'll do it while we're here. And one thing, wouldn't it be nice if Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom at least used the same symbols up top for the tools? Some of them do match, the oval and the linear gradients. But, of course, the spot removal tool is a little brushy thing. So let's go ahead. I've got a spot here that's obvious. Not sure if this thing in the middle is a spot. So let's click on Visualize Spots, which is way down on the lower right, which will turn it black and white. Oh, and here's one I didn't see. There's a spot right there. You can see that perfect circle. And there's also one right over here. Again, every time you see this perfect circle. Now, this thing right here, is it a spot? Not sure. Let's turn off Visualize Spot and see if something shows up. Maybe, maybe not. So I'm just going to play it safe and just get rid of it. I'll be done with that. Let's turn off the Visualize Spots. Is there anything else here I want to do while I'm in Adobe Camera Raw? I think that's probably enough. We'll add contrast and things like that in Photoshop itself. So let's click Open Image. So this is now going to open it up in Photoshop, and once we open up a file in Photoshop, it is no longer a raw file. But again, we still have our raw file available to us. This basically just opens a copy as a Photoshop file. So let's zoom in on this a little bit more and see what's going on. So over on the right-hand side, we've got our background by itself. First thing always, again, Command J or Control J to create a copy of that so that we don't mess with the original file. And by the way, when we're here, I'll show you a quick, really a cool trick for adding a little bit of pop to images in Photoshop. And that's when you create this safety layer, come up to here where it says normal. This is called the blending mode, and bring it down to overlay. Now at 100% it's way overblown, but if we bring it down to 35% or so, let's say 35, 34, close enough. Now if we turn this on and off, just by doing that, look at the difference. Love what it did to the foreground. Do not like what it did to the sky. The sky has gone a little bit too, it's a little too contrasty, too blue. Maybe I like a little bit of the effect, but not all of it. So since this is in Photoshop, we're going to add a layer mask to this. And you do that with this little rectangle with the circle in the middle, and that gives us a layer mask. Now it's pure white, which means nothing is going on in there yet. So we're going to add a gradient over the top of this. If you haven't used the gradient tool before, what's going to happen is you're not going to get a gradient. You're going to get this little group of folders. So in most of the times you're going to want this one. And what this means is foreground color to transparent. So in this case, I've got black in the foreground, white in the background, and I want it to go to transparent. And I'm going to click about right here, right over the middle of the road. I'm going to hold down the Shift key. What that does is it keeps it perfectly straight, actually in 45-degree increments. So you can see as I rotate around, it can do it in 45. And I'm going to just let go. And you can see now, if I temporarily hide this layer, now you can see that the effect that we just did is only happening below. And you can see over here, here's our gradient. Now if I hold down the Alt or Option key and click on our mask, you get to see the mask. So there is the gradient mask. So I click back on the thumbnail icon and I decide, maybe I'd like a little bit of that overlay effect to come through. So what you can do is actually click on the mask, and we're actually going to double click on it. And that brings up a mask properties. And what it allows us to do is maybe bring the transparency of the mask up or down. So if we make it 100% transparent, that's not doing anything. There's the sky that's gone too much. At 100%, it's not doing anything. Let's see if we bring it down 50 or 60%. We get a little bit of that pop effect, but not too much. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So we'll hit OK there. And now the mask is actually at about 60%. So that's good. So what else is going on? Well, color issues. Do we like the color? It seems a little bit off, and I'm not exactly sure why. And it might be off in two different ways. It might be off in the sky, and it might be off in the foreground, but it might be done differently. So something I like to do if I think I'm going to do a sky edit is select the sky so that I can have a mask for it later. And I'm going to use the Magic Wand tool, which is right here. And I'm just going to simply click in the sky. I'm using the default settings, which is 32 pixel tolerance. That's fine. And I want to add to this. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key, come down to the horizon more, and get these. Now I have all this stuff above the horizon now. So I'm going to switch to the rectangular marquee tool, hold down the Shift, which means add, and I'm going to basically select everything from there up to the top. So you can see there we have our sky, just the sky. So before we do anything else, under select, I'm going to save this selection and just call it sky so that I can get back to it later. Oh, capital K, who cares? All right, so we have our sky selected. Now I'm just going to hit Command or Control D to deselect that. Let's do a color edit. In fact, to do that, to make it a little easier, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, kind of in the middle of the image. All right, so let's go down here to this little half white, half black circle, and these are adjustment layers, and we're going to do a color balance adjustment layer. Now yours might not be as large as this when you first open. In fact, it's probably going to be something like that. I'm just making it bigger so you can see it a little better. And it starts at midtones. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to add a little bit both ways. Actually, we're going to add a lot both ways. A lot of cyan, a lot of red. And they both look awful, but you might decide, gee, one looks a little less awful. In this case, I think red. So I think what that means is in the midtones, it needs a little bit of red. Nowhere near like that full amount, but maybe something like that. Maybe that's a little too much. I'm going to back off a little bit, about 10 points or so. All right, 13 is good. Let's do the same for magenta and green. I'm going to take a little bit less, add some magenta. Actually, that looks pretty good. Add some green. This gets a little bit subjective. I think maybe a little bit magenta, just a smidge. And then we'll do yellow. We'll add a bunch of blue, a bunch of yellow. Actually, I think it needs a little bit of blue, so something about like that. So now click on where it says midtones, and we're going to do the same thing for the highlights. We'll add some red, some cyan. Nope, it needs a little bit of red. Magenta, green. And you can see what it's affecting is most of this kind of red dirt out here. And actually, I do remember what this place looks like. It wasn't quite that magenta, so we'll add a little green, and then we'll do yellow and blue. It actually needs a little bit of blue. And then lastly, let's do the same thing for the shadows. We'll add some cyan, some red, some cyan. So this is, again, a subjective call. I'm going to give it a very little bit of red. Just a little bit. Magenta, green, needs a little green. If you can see this, you can see it mostly in the street in front. The magenta looks odd. So we'll add a little bit of green, which isn't necessarily thinking it as adding green. Think of it as taking out magenta. So some yellow, some blue. All right, we need a little blue there. All right, so I'm going to hide this panel. And right down here, I'm going to click on the eyeball, and we're going to hide that so we can see. So the color adjustment we made is subtle. But look at the street. It's got a little bit more warmth to it. I do like it. All right, so let's back off to full screen, which is Command 0. And let's look at it again. Yeah, I like what it did. And actually, it made a nice effect on the sky. What else is going on? Well, this is a little bit too dark still. And maybe this is a little too much color. I do want to add a little more saturation to the image first, though. So let's, again, go down to here and go to Use Saturation. And again, the beauty of having this on adjustment layers like we have in Photoshop is that we can mask out certain spots. So let's see what some more saturation does. I like what it's doing to the foreground. I like how it's adding the pop. I don't like what it's doing to the sky. See, it's making the sky unnaturally blue. But fortunately, if you remember, we saved this sky earlier. So we're going to add some saturation. And with the mask selected, so we have our mask, but remember we selected the sky. So let's bring it back. I'm going to go to Select, Load Selection, and click on where it says Channel and choose, there's my sky with my capital K, and that's going to make that selection. So I don't want this to get the effect of this saturation. So since it is all selected now, and I have black in the foreground over here, Option or Alt Delete will fill that with black. So now if I hold down the Alt or Option and click on that mask, you can see there it is. There's just our sky. So Command D to deselect that. So now if I toggle this on and off, as soon as it's done drawing, if I toggle this on and off, you can see, again, it's a subtle correction, but you can see the foreground getting a little bit more saturation, and now it's leaving the sky alone. So compositionally, what do I want this image to be? I think there's maybe a little bit too much road in the front. We really want to lead to here. I want to simplify the image, so I'm going to bring up the crop tool, which is the C key. Let me hit Command 0 to fit it in the screen. And I'm going to bring down, I don't need that much sky. I'm going to bring up from the bottom. I want to make this kind of a panoramic feel. And by the way, when you're creating something like this, you want to make sure that leading lines don't go exactly into a corner, because that's the effect of pulling you out. So for example, if I come right to here, see how this black line is there? That is actually has a tendency to lead you out. So make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm going to bring it up a little bit. I want to leave a little bit more road, about there. I'm going to take a little bit off the left just to, again, add some more interest to the middle of the image. And by doing that, I want the line in the middle of the street, in the middle of the frame. So I'm going to drag this over. That put this thing on my exact corner. So I'm going to just back it off a little bit so we don't have that effect. And then hit enter. Okay, I like that composition a lot better. So if we take a look where we started, I'll just hide these layers. That's the image we started with, and that's where we are now. Is there more we could do? Yes, we could add some more contrasts, things like that. There's a lot more we could do with the color. Oh, what the heck. Let's do a curves adjustment. So here's our curves tool. Now curves, if I wanted to add contrast, I can create what's called an S-curve. And the easiest way to do that is to click on each of these grids and put some control points. I'll put 1, 2, 3 on these grids. If I bring this one down, here's the histogram again, and this is black, this is white. If I drag this down, that makes the shadows darker, so it's going to add contrast. And if I bring this up, it's going to make the whites whiter. And this is your midtones. I can make the midtones lighter or darker. Now, in here got a little too dark, and I'm not sure exactly what this is. So I can get this finger and bring it in here, and you see it's way down here. So if I want to bring just that up, look, I can open up just those shadows there without affecting much of the rest of the image. Maybe that was a little bit too much. So I can actually take that point and bring it down. And another way I can lighten it up is drag that to the right. And then maybe decide I got to back off on the contrast on the foreground a little bit. But that was enough to just open up these shadows a smidge. Midtones, let's bring those down a little bit. And this is actually the white point. If I don't want these clouds to be pure white, I can literally just bring this down, and that will do that. All right, so if we turn this on and off, what do I like? Do I like what it did? I do, maybe a little bit too contrasty. And I don't like what it did to the sky as we turn this off again. So if you remember on the previous hue saturation adjustment, we had the sky already selected. So rather than have to go get that sky selection, I can hold down the Alt key, click on the mask, drag it up to our new one, and look what just happened. Now it's only affecting the foreground. Now I like almost everything it's done here. I like what it did to the street. I like over here a bit, but this little stretch on the right and this little bit over the left is a little bit too much. See, again, as I take this, it's gotten a little bit too saturated, too contrasty. So I want to back off on this. So I'm going to click on the mask, get a brush, and I'm going to make a brush about yo big. I'm going to paint at 50%. So if you go to opacity here, all you have to do is type 5 if you want 50%, you want 20%, type 2, go back to 50. And I'm just going to roughly paint over there and over there. And that's all it needed to fix it. In fact, if we hold down Alt again and look at the mask, you can see there's those little gray splashes that I just painted in to take off a little bit of that curves effect. All right, so now I think I'm happy with the image. Now I want to prepare this so it's something that can send out to a lab to be printed. So I need to come up to View, Proof Setup, Custom. Now this is going to go out to a lab, to like a large format printer, and generally the preferred format for that is Adobe RGB in a TIFF file. So that's what I had been using before. It'll go to wherever you want it last. There's Adobe RGB. And now perceptual versus relative color metric. In this case, nothing's going to happen because the entire image is within that space. Where you're going to see this change is when you choose papers for your own printer. We'll cover this another day. So we need to tell the image, if it's not already, we need to convert it. And you don't do a sign, you do convert. It's in Adobe RGB already because I had changed it. But if it was something different, you need to make sure that the destination space is Adobe RGB. In this case, relative versus perceptual doesn't matter. By the way, forget saturation and absolute color metric or even there, because if you ever choose them, it's going to be bad. Black point compensation, yes. Dither, yes. Flatten image, optional. We'll go ahead and flatten it for this, for our uses. We'll hit OK. You see it flattens the image. Now we have an Adobe RGB image ready to go. And now we just do a save as. So I'm going to call it save. Let's see, we'll call it for large format. And it's a TIFF file, and you see it already says it's in Adobe RGB. Now I click on save. We'll use the default settings. I'm not going to mess with those. And now we have a file that is ready to go out to our lab for printing. And what the beauty is, it's going to come back looking like this. As I look at this image, before I do send it off to a print, I do see one other thing compositionally, tonally, that is a problem, and that's the shadows still on this hill are still too deep. Because what happens in an image is generally you go to either the brightest thing, in this case there is no really brightest thing, but absent of that you go to the darkest thing. So this side of this hill here has become so dark that it draws your eye. It draws your eye away from the subject. So we need to fix that. So here's what we're going to do. I got the magic wand tool here. We're going to click on this side of the hill here. I'm going to add this in. So to add any of the selection tools, hold down the shift key. You see you get a little plus next to it or underneath it. By the way, if you want to subtract, hold down the alt key and you get a minus underneath it. But I want to add, so I'm going to hold down the shift key and I'm going to get this area here. And I think that pretty much gets everything I wanted here. Oh, while I'm at it, this little piece here opposite it, let's get rid of that too. Because that's, well, not get rid of it. It's a little too dark as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a levels adjustment. So I'm going to come down to our adjustment layers here, and we're going to go to levels. Now, since I already had these selected, you can see it already created a mask. So if I hold down Alt and click on the mask, you can see there's what it picked up, which is exactly what we want. So I've got levels here. I want to lighten these up. And here's our histograms where you can see the area that we've selected is all very dark. And counterintuitively, I'm going to drag the center slider, which is the midpoint, towards this dark area, and look what happens. I mean, there, you can make it white, but look what happens, how it lightens up those shadows so that they don't become a distraction. They're still there. In fact, the one on this side of the road has gone too light, so I'm going to have to do something with that separately. But the one on the side of the hill now is not a distraction. It's still in shadow, but it's not so dark to be a distraction. So that was the answer for that. And for this one over on this right-hand side that got just a little too light, I'm going to click on the mask itself, this thing right over here, get a brush, and I'm going to paint it about 30%. So up on opacity, I'm just going to hit the 3 key, and you see it changes to 30%. And I'm going to start painting black over top of this. Now it's just the mask, so it's only going to affect that. So as I do that, I can start gradually bringing it down until it's what looks like the right darkness for me. It's going to be dark, but I don't want it to be that solid black. So now again, if I hold down the Alt key and click on the mask, you can see it's still there. In fact, here, I'll even paint over top of it a little more. You can see it's still there, the mask, but it's grayed out. So that means it's only getting a partial effect of that levels adjustment, and that looks a lot better. So let's just temporarily turn this on and off so you see the difference. Look at how it opened up those shadows to the point where they're still in shadow, but they're not a distraction. Now we're able to focus on this long road heading back down into Monument Valley again. Great. So one other place I'd like to do this same thing for. I'm going to get the magic wand tool again, and I'm going to click on this formation that in the haze has got a little bit too blue for my liking. So I'm going to hold down the shift key and add to these deep shadows here. All I want to do is just bring them down a little bit. All right, so the same thing. I'm going to create another levels adjustment. And in this case, I want to darken it, so I'm going to take the middle slider to the right. And you can see I could make it solid black, which would look weird. I just want to darken them up a little bit. And let's see how that looks before and after. Just enough, yeah. The blue is to be expected, actually. That's what happens in a haze. It goes a little bit blue, so I'm going to leave that alone. But again, look at those two adjustments. First, we opened up the shadows on the side of the hill. and then just darkened off this a little bit. Now, since the sun is coming from the left of the image, we expect this area to be a little bit lighter than over here. And you can see as the shadow's being cast. So the sun's coming this way. So we don't want this to be even to that, because that would be wrong. But just by making those two little levels adjustments locally to those two spots, now we have an image that works a lot better. And now I think this is the one that we would send out to print. That's a little taste of color correction and soft proofing in Photoshop, just scratching the surface. But I just wanted to give you a quick intro, because we're going to go into this in a lot more detail real soon. Bringing up that image of Monument Valley brought back some memories. I actually captured this image just this past November, but every time I leave these places, I can't wait to get back. So I'm looking forward to the travel restrictions to ease so I can get back out there. Now, I know video monitors don't do any justice to what an image really looks like, but this is the pre and this is the post edit of the image, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. So I hope you saw some tips and tricks that you can put to use. We're just starting in Photoshop, but there's a lot more to do. In fact, a lot more to do than we were coded in Lightroom, because it's a much more involved program. So thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to my newsletter. It goes out every Friday, and it's got cool stuff like this in it pretty much every week. So hope you're all well. Hope you're safe. Think about the things that you can do rather than what you can't do, and you'll be a lot happier. Don't watch so much news. I'll see you online again soon. Bye-bye.